Writing. The morning sunlight slipped through the thin kitchen curtains like quiet hope, but the small house on Alder Street still carried the weight of too many lonely mornings. For years, it had been just one man, and the echo of responsibilities he never asked for. And on that particular morning, when a small voice suddenly declared that she was staying there with him, the house that once felt empty somehow felt impossibly small. Before we begin, take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel Heartfelt Stories if you believe in kindness and second chances. Stories like this remind us that sometimes the smallest moments can change an entire life. Elias Navarro had built his life out of quiet endurance. At 38, he already carried the tired posture of someone who had lived twice as many years. His modest home sat at the edge of a sleepy neighborhood, where the sidewalks were cracked and the maple trees leaned slightly as if listening to the lives beneath them. Inside the house, everything was neat but worn. The couch had a permanent dip in the middle. The refrigerator hummed like it had secrets. The walls held only a few photographs, most of them faded, all of them precious. Every morning followed the same rhythm. Elias woke before the sun, brewed coffee that was always a little too strong, and opened the windows to let the daylight creep into the quiet rooms. It was the only way he knew how to keep loneliness from settling too deeply into the corners. Becoming a single father had not been part of his plan. Years earlier, life had collapsed around him when tragedy carved a sudden hole in the center of everything he knew. Since then, raising his young daughter had been his entire world. He learned how to braid hair by watching internet tutorials late at night. He burned more pancakes than he could count before finally getting them right. He packed lunches with tiny handwritten notes that simply said things like "You are brave" or "Today will be good." Parenting alone had turned him into someone stronger than he ever imagined, but also someone permanently tired. His daughter, Aria, was 9 years old and carried a spirit that seemed bigger than their entire neighborhood. She moved through the world like sunlight itself, bright, curious, and impossible to ignore. While Elias worried about bills and work shifts and the slow leaking roof above the hallway, Aria worried about things like whether butterflies had best friends and why clouds looked different every day. Despite the struggles, their life had found a quiet balance. Until that Tuesday morning. The day had begun like any other. The sunlight was warm, the air carried the gentle scent of spring grass, and the neighborhood kids were already riding their bicycles up and down the street. Elias stood at the kitchen sink, washing a single plate, when he heard the front door open and close much earlier than expected. Aria had returned home from school. That alone was strange. When he turned around, he saw her standing in the doorway with a backpack that looked heavier than usual and a serious expression that didn't belong on a child's face. Behind her stood another girl, smaller, quieter, clutching the straps of a worn backpack as though it were the only stable thing in the world. Elias instantly felt the air shift. Children carried stories in their eyes, and the girl behind Aria had the kind that spoke of sleepless nights and uncertain tomorrows. Aria stepped forward with determination that seemed far older than 9 years. In a voice that carried both courage and gentle pleading, she explained that the girl's name was Nola Reyes. Nola had been sitting alone outside the school office after classes ended, waiting for someone who never arrived. Teachers had been whispering. Phones had been ringing. Something about a parent who could not be reached. Aria had simply taken Nola's hand and brought her home. And then came the sentence that changed everything. She calmly announced that Nola was staying there with them. Elias felt the house shrink around him. His first instinct was panic. Their home was small, their money tight, their lives already balanced on careful routines. There were rules, responsibilities, systems he had built to survive single parenthood. But then he looked at Nola. Her shoes were scuffed, her sleeves too short for her growing arms, and her eyes carried a quiet fear that no child should have to hold. In that moment, Elias understood something simple and heavy. Sometimes life places another fragile soul directly in front of you and waits to see what kind of person you will be. So he exhaled slowly. The house was small, the future uncertain. But compassion had never required perfect conditions. That afternoon unfolded in gentle, unexpected ways. Aria showed Nola every corner of the house, as if it were a palace rather than a modest 2-bedroom home. The girls filled the living room with laughter, turning couch cushions into imaginary castles and the narrow hallway into a racetrack for toy cars. Elias watched quietly from the kitchen. Something in the air had changed. For years, the house had carried the silence of survival. Now it carried the chaotic, joyful noise of childhood multiplied. Still, reality remained complicated. Phone calls were made. School administrators spoke in cautious tones. Social workers asked questions. It became clear that Nola's situation was more fragile than anyone expected. Her mother had disappeared without explanation, leaving behind unanswered calls and an apartment that neighbors said had been empty for days. Temporary arrangements needed to be made. And somehow, almost unbelievably, the temporary solution became Elias. The following days felt like walking through unfamiliar terrain. There were extra plates on the table, extra shoes by the door, and a second small voice asking whether there was more cereal. The tiny house adjusted in quiet ways. An air mattress appeared in Aria's room. The laundry loads doubled, and the refrigerator emptied faster than ever before. But something else happened too. The house began to feel warmer. Elias noticed in the mornings when sunlight spilled across two girls laughing over breakfast. He noticed it when homework time turned into a messy collaboration at the kitchen table. He noticed it when the hallway light stayed on a little later, because stories were still being told. The home that once felt lonely had begun to breathe differently. Weeks passed. Investigations continued. Yet the temporary arrangement slowly transformed into something deeper. Nola began to smile more often. The quiet sadness in her eyes softened into cautious hope. She planted small flowers in the backyard with Aria and carefully watered them every afternoon, like someone nurturing a promise. Elias, who had spent years simply trying to keep life from falling apart, found himself experiencing something unexpected. The quiet pride of being needed twice over. It wasn't easy. Some nights he lay awake worrying about finances and responsibilities that seemed to grow larger each day. But every morning when the sun filled the kitchen and two sleepy voices argued over pancakes, he felt something stronger than worry. He felt purpose. If this story is touching your heart so far, take a moment to comment and tell us where you're watching from. Your support helps keep stories like this alive on the Heartfelt Stories channel. Eventually, a meeting was scheduled with social services. Elias walked into the building carrying more anxiety than he wanted to admit. The outcome could change everything. Nola might be placed somewhere else. Their fragile new routine might disappear overnight. But when the social worker finished explaining the situation, something unexpected happened. They asked Elias if he would consider becoming Nola's long-term guardian. The room felt silent for several seconds. Elias thought about the cramped house, the bills, the sleepless nights. He thought about responsibility doubling overnight. But he also thought about two girls planting flowers in the backyard and laughing like sisters. And he realized something quietly powerful. The house had never actually been too small. His heart had simply been waiting to grow. The paperwork took months, but the outcome slowly became real. Nola stayed. The air mattress was replaced by a real bed. The walls gained new drawings and brighter colors. The house that once echoed with loneliness now carried the joyful chaos of two children building a shared childhood. Elias sometimes stood in the kitchen doorway during bright daytime afternoons, watching the girls run across the yard with the kind of carefree energy that only safety can create. And every time he heard them laugh, he remembered the moment everything changed, the moment a brave little girl walked through the door and declared that she was staying. Before we close this story, here's a special request. Comment the word home if you believe kindness can create family even when life begins with strangers. Because sometimes family doesn't arrive the way we expect. Sometimes it walks to the front door on an ordinary morning, carrying a worn backpack and a quiet hope for somewhere safe to stay. And if this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to Heartfelt Stories so more people can experience stories that remind us how powerful compassion can be. Because the smallest houses can hold the biggest miracles.